Good evening, everyone. We would like to welcome you to the February version of Night with the Experts. This is a monthly program by Nuclear Energy Information Service, where we bring experts from all over, in this case, the world, to you to discuss various nuclear topics. I'm Dave Kraft, Director of NEIS in Chicago. You'll be joined tonight by my colleague Jan Boudart, who is on the NEIS board. And we are really pleased to let you know that tonight is a very special occurrence. We are truly international this evening. Our guest speaker, Dr. Elizabeth Tynan, is a professor from the James Cook University in Australia and also an author of two books, perhaps more that I'm not aware of, Atomic Thunder and The Secret of Emu Field. She'll tell you more about that in a little bit. I'm also pleased to say that we have our events lined up for the next several months. At the end of tonight's session, we'll fill you in on the guests that we have in mind, but they are going to continue with the theme of the nuclear environmental justice issues and radiation exposures. We'll get into some of the details of that in a little bit. So I want to remind you all that we will be recording the session tonight. And if in our session later, when we get to the question and answer and dialogue, if you don't want to appear, make sure you turn your camera off when you ask your questions or engage in the conversation. So I think that's about all the instructions I need to give you for the moment. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Jan Boudart, who will introduce tonight's guest. Jan?
Thank you, Dave. Uh, Um, I met Liz Tynan on Zoom. I went to something and I don't recall exactly what it was, but I was very intrigued by by her presentation and by herself. Um, it was really interesting to me to see somebody who really understood what's going on in Australia and understands what happens when an area of the world is colonized by the people who haven't lived there forever, just as we did with the Native Americans, and how how their areas can be suddenly taken over and they don't have much say as to what's going on. Um, Also, the thing that think is really interesting about Liz, or at least interesting to me, I'm sure that if many of us walked into a room with a bunch of old shoeboxes full of dusty papers, we'd say, "Oh no." But Liz thinks, "Oh, this is going to be fun." And so I really appreciate her. And I did read the um Atomic Thunder, the story of Mar-a-Lago, and the Secret of Emu Field. And she does have a new book coming out. She can give us the name of it. It's going to be about the Montebello Islands because there were three basic areas in Australia that were used for testing atomic bombs, and the British used them. So I'm just going to let Elizabeth go ahead and do her presentation, and we're so happy to have you here. And also the audience. Uh, it's not the numbers that count. The people here are just, it's we got a great audience, Liz.
Oh, that's wonderful. And thank you so much, David and Jan. It's a delight to be here to have the opportunity to talk to you about the extraordinary era in Australian history of British atomic testing. So I'm just going to get my presentation up on the screen. Just bear with me for one moment. And you may be interested to know that that photograph that you can see now was taken at Maralinga, not Mar-a-Lago, Maralinga.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Did I say Mar-a-Lago?
Yes, it's at the top of
Oh,
your
dear.
mind, clearly. But Maralinga, and I will talk about Maralinga, but that is the main weapons testing site in Australia, in the South Australian desert. And this photo was taken when I was there traveling from Maralinga to Emu Field a few years ago now, and the sun was coming up, and it struck me that it looked a little bit like an atomic mushroom cloud on the horizon as we were heading towards Emu Field, which is 200 kilometres to the north of Maralinga. So I've always been, that photo brings me right back to that moment when we were leaving Maralinga for our long day going up to Emu Field. I'll tell you about that, and I've got plenty of photos to share as well. And I can talk to you about the third book that I've got coming out. It's I'm up to my ears at the moment in proofreading, so we're very close to finalising production of the new book. But we'll get to that as we go along. It's a fascinating story. I do see it as a story that has a bit of everything. You know, there are spies, there are scientists, there are politicians, there are Indigenous people, there are Bushmen in Australia. That's part of the law here. LORE is our outback, our bush. Now, I just saw a note saying someone can't hear, so I'm curious to know whether everyone can hear me now. Yeah? Okay. Well, there might just be an individual problem with one participant. But so I just want to give an overview, but I will be very, very keen to hear your questions in due course, and we will see what sorts of things interest you. And I would love to continue this conversation even after the presentation. So, but I've called the talk Dangerous Games, and it echoes a quote from this gentleman, James McClelland, known far and wide as Diamond Jim, because he was a rather flamboyant former politician, but he was at the time that he made this quote, he was the president of the Royal Commission into British nuclear tests in Australia. And Royal Commissions are judicial inquiries. That's the name they have in Australia. They have a number of features that enable them to call evidence, and they are fully judicial inquiries. And he said that Australia became the oval on which Britain's nuclear game was to be played. It set some of the tone for the inquiry and indeed the report, and indeed the epic transcript, which is, I've lost count, 11,000 pages or something like that of transcript, where Diamond Jim was very much engaged in the questioning of witnesses, and the whole Royal Commission was a human drama played out over a number of months all around Australia, but also they took it to London. They had to, because some of the key British players were too old by then to travel. So they had to take the inquiry at huge expense to London. And at that time, Margaret Thatcher was the British Prime Minister, and the Royal Commission put a huge amount of pressure on her to release millions of files that had been kept secret. So the Royal Commission really opened things up, opened up a lot of the evidence. Until then, it had largely been closed. And Australia, extraordinarily, knew virtually nothing about what the British had actually done during the 1950s and 1960s on its territory. So that in itself is shameful, I think. And it really took some very brave whistleblowers and some investigative journalists in the 70s and 80s and an Indigenous man who I'll introduce you to shortly as well, to really start to make two governments accountable. So anyway, let's think about what happened. So even in Australia, many people simply don't know that nuclear weapons were tested here. It is something that always surprises me. I shouldn't be surprised, but it's true that it's not part of the national conversation. I've done what I can, and I'll continue to do so, to bring it into that conversation because it's extremely important. It's an important part of Australian history. It's not just exactly what happened at the time, but it also speaks to ideas of sovereignty, and it speaks to geopolitics, and it speaks to very current issues now around, for instance, the new AUKUS agreement, which is an agreement between the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia, which would see Australia for the first time ever getting nuclear-powered submarines, which most of us don't want. But there are a whole range of issues that arise from the era of the nuclear tests. It lasted, the very first test was in 1952, and the mushroom cloud tests ended in 57, but the radiological experiments continued until 1963. There were 3 locations. I've written 3 books dealing with the different locations. The first book was Atomic Thunder, the Maralinga story, which dealt with the main site, Maralinga. I followed it up with The Secret of Emu Field, Britain's forgotten atomic tests in Australia, because very few people, I mean, no one knows about Maralinga. They certainly don't know about Emu Field. And yet what happened at Emu Field had profound implications, particularly for Indigenous people living in Central Australia. I'll get to that because that's an important story. And Montebello Islands is the Western Australian end of the tests. These are uninhabited islands off the coast of Western Australia, out in the Indian Ocean. I visited there last July. It was an extraordinary place. I've got some images to share with you and some information about what happened there, including the fact that the largest ever nuclear test held in Australia was detonated from the Montebello Islands. And it sparked panic. People thought, for a short while anyway, that it had been a nuclear accident. It actually wasn't. The British knew how big it was going to be. They just didn't tell the Australian government. And so when it was very big, and when the fallout was detected by a miner using Geiger counters in Western Australia, the acting Prime Minister of Australia at the time sent a cable to Winston Churchill back in the UK saying, "What the bloody hell are you doing?" And that, of course, was very secret until it came out in the Royal Commission. So there's a lot to talk about here. There was a total of 12 mushroom cloud tests held in Australia, 3 at Montebello, 2 at Emu Field, and 7 at Maralinga. But there were hundreds of radiological experiments as well. Very, very dirty experiments that left a lot of contamination. So that's a big part of the story too, which I'll get to. Britain made the political decision that it was too risky to test these weapons on its own territory, even though physically it was possible to do so. And they did have a look at the Hebrides and other areas of the UK, but they sensed, and they probably tested this with populations, that it was too risky politically. And so they even made a ruling that these weapons could not be tested on their own territory. So they had a former empire, as you would be aware, and they went looking. So they took the path of nuclear colonialism, and unfortunately they landed upon Australia. They tried plenty of other places, including Canada. They went a fair distance down the road to organising to test in Canada, particularly at a place called Churchill, which I think is kind of interesting, which these days I believe is a sanctuary for polar bears. It would not be now if those bombs had been tested there. There were many places they wanted to go, but they landed on Australia. And so hence the story I'm telling today. And what happened there, I've written 3 books and there is still a lot more to know. And yes, when I get a box of dusty files, I'm in my happy place. That's the best thing I can do, is go to the British Archives in London or go to the Australian Archives in Canberra, or to the various other specialised archives, such as ones that I've been to at the University of Cambridge or University of Oxford or Birmingham, and immerse myself in the files. If the British will let me, they have from time to time withdrawn a lot of files, and then sometimes they will capriciously put them back. They're still keeping a lot hidden. And I'm sure that the likes of me are a bit of a nuisance to them. I don't care. I'm going to keep doing it. So, yes, the UK searched through lots of former territories. Australia was certainly not its first choice. And in fact, it's quite contemptuous of Australia in a lot of the documents that I have seen. There were some benefits, though, to choosing Australia in that it had, in 1949, it elected a conservative government, which confusingly to North American audiences is known as the Liberal Party, but in fact it's more like the Republicans. And Robert Menzies was the Prime Minister elected then, and he was well known as an Anglophile. So he was very close to the so-called mother country. They didn't necessarily feel the same way in return, but he presided over a conservative government. And Australia, of course, is a stable Western-style democracy with large open spaces, and so it appealed to that extent to the British. But what didn't appeal to the British was the fact that the Americans did not have a very good opinion of Australian security. And so there were all sorts of security issues that arose. And as a direct result of the nuclear tests and plans for the nuclear tests, Australia set up two different security organisations, and it enacted all sorts of draconian legislation, particularly around prohibiting territory to stop people from entering. It also started what are known as D notices, which are defence notices that are intended to restrict what the media can report. And it's a form of self-censorship. The media enters willingly into these agreements. And they started as a direct result of the nuclear tests. So now Australia had agency. It was not a colony anymore. It still is a sovereign government. It did have the capacity to say no, but the fact that our government at that time, Robert Menzies' government, did not exercise agency points, I think, to the weight of colonial history bearing down upon individual decision makers at that time. And a general sense as well. Well, there were several things. There was a sense that if Australia agreed to what Britain was proposing, then Australia would be guaranteed defence support in the event of a war, another war. Also, Australia had large deposits of uranium, the raw material needed for these weapons, and Menzies was trying to shore up a market. He had no trouble doing that. America wanted our uranium as well. And he also wanted Australia to be nuclear armed and powered. It never has been to this day, although AUKUS may change some of that. Now, Britain just placed an obligation on Australia very, very readily when Menzies said yes to these tests and walked away without a backward glance. Left a huge mess behind and very little information supplied to the Australian government about what that mess entailed. It was forced to start reckoning with that in the mid-1980s at the Royal Commission. It still hasn't completely reckoned with it, and there's still quite a large component of Australian society, the ones who do know about it, particularly the Indigenous people, but also the military veterans who are still attempting to gain at least some recognition from the British government that they did great harm in our country. So, but there was a sense of imperial aloofness which still pertains, I think, and a sense of entitlement in its dealings with Australia. And that view there is actually Emu Field with its massive big blue sky. I'll get to what happened at Emu shortly. But they looked everywhere. So you can see, the Shetlands and the Hebrides were part of the search, but also the Bahamas, closer to where you are, and the Falkland Islands, West Africa, Somaliland, various islands in the Pacific and the Indian Oceans were all examined. And you can just see an excerpt there from a historical document. But then in 1954, that's when it was announced that no nuclear experiments would be held on UK soil. By then, they'd already detonated 3 weapons on Australian soil without any safeguards. So it's quite extraordinary to think that safety was not at the top of their minds, but it really wasn't. That is the moment of detonation of Totem 1 at Emu Field in October 1953. Obviously, they had lots of photos. That was a secret image that was only fairly recently declassified. And Totem 1 caused enormous, enormous harm. There were profound implications for a lot of people, particularly Aboriginal populations. This Totem 1 was detonated at Emu Field in Central Australia, and that is the homeland for Anangu people, Aboriginal people in Australia. And Totem 1 caused what became known as the black mist, which was a cloud that detached from the main mushroom cloud. We don't know exactly what was in it. It wasn't investigated at the time. It was only in retrospect that this came out, but it rolled over Indigenous populations 170 kilometres. What's that, about over 100 miles northeast of the Emu Field site. And it killed some people immediately, but it caused ongoing health problems for many, many others into the future to the present day. So and some of that started to come out later with a particular Aboriginal whistleblower activist, which I'll get to him in a moment. Here are the people you might like to know, because you might not be familiar with some of the key players in Britain and Australia at the time. So there's Robert Menzies, the Conservative Prime Minister, who, when he was elected in 1949, he actually stayed in. This is terrifying politically. He stayed Prime Minister for 16 years, the longest time anyone has ever been a Prime Minister in Australia. We have a different system to yours. So he kept on being re-elected. Imagine having a certain individual in power for 16 years. Well, this was before my time, but he was Prime Minister for a very long time, and he is the one who facilitated what happened. Then there was Clement Attlee, the Labor Prime Minister in the UK, who oversaw the development of the bomb to a crucial point, not quite to the testing point, but was the Prime Minister who instigated the bomb program in the UK at the end of the Second World War. This is a character called Frederick Lindemann, Lord Cherwell, who was a physicist, but he was also a politician. And he was a close confidant of Winston Churchill, who, of course, had been the wartime Prime Minister. A lot of people don't realise that he actually came back in 1951. He was re-elected Prime Minister in 1951. He was old and sick when he came back. But one of the people who was most influential in his decision-making around the British bomb was Frederick Lindemann. And he was a great booster for Britain having its own weapon. It couldn't, by law, work with the United States. In 1946, the United States instituted the McMahon Act, the Atomic Energy Act, which made it illegal for America to work with any other country on nuclear weapons or energy development because of the spies. There were spies in the Manhattan Project, and there were some British spies who did a fair amount of damage. So Klaus Fuchs was one, Alan Nunn May. And because of that, that was the publicly stated reason, or that was the apparent reason for blocking research and development with other countries. There's speculation that the real reason is the United States wanted to corner the market, and they could see that nuclear energy was going to be a big money spinner and important to the economy. They didn't want other countries to be involved in that. So for 10 years or so, Britain was locked out of research and development with the United States and couldn't use the United States test sites. So Lord Cherwell, Frederick Lindemann, was among those who said to Churchill, "We don't need the Americans. We are going to do this alone." And he was a great believer in that happening. And they did develop it, although by the end of the 1950s, when parts of the McMahon Act were repealed, the British started working again with the United States, and they just walked away from Australia and left it all there. Ernest Titterton was a British physicist who had been part of the Manhattan Project. He, in fact, had turned the dial on the Trinity test in July 1945. He was a true believer. He's often called Australia's Dr. Strangelove. He came to Australia to live after the war, and he set up the School of Nuclear Physics at the Australian National University, which incidentally is where I got my PhD. Both my parents worked there. My father worked with Ernest Titterton, and there are all these sort of connections. But Titterton was famously crazy. You know, he was really determined to put the best possible spin on the nuclear tests in Australia, and he was often in the news talking about how safe it was and how important it was. He was a true believer. Now, William Penny is a slightly more complicated character. He is the inventor of the British bomb. He had 2 PhDs. He was a leader in the Manhattan Project. He took the British mission from the UK to the Manhattan Project. He was a brilliant scientist, also a much nicer person than Ernest Titterton. And later he became quite conflicted about his role in the development of the British weapon. But he built the bomb. He tested the bomb. He wasn't present for every test in Australia, but he was present for most of them. And a very interesting character. And he's one of the reasons why the Royal Commission in the mid-1980s went to the UK. Because William Penny was too sick to travel by then, but they needed him for evidence, and he was grilled at the Royal Commission to the point where some people say that it compromised his health and he died soon after. Yami Lester, one of my heroes, he was a child, he was about 12 at the time of Operation Totem at Emu Field, and he was in one of those Aboriginal communities where the black mist rolled over them. He, over a period of years, not immediately, but over a period of years, he lost his eyesight completely. And it's possible, we don't know for sure, but it's possible that it was a direct result from exposure to the black mist. He, despite his blindness, he became a very important campaigner. His daughter continues that today. Karina Lester is a very important anti-nuclear campaigner in this country. Yami Lester died a few years ago. But he was the one. He actually went with a lawyer to London in the early 80s, and he confronted the British government about what had happened, and particularly Operation Totem in 1953 at Emu Field that caused so much harm to his people. So he was a really important whistleblower. There was a military whistleblower as well called Avon Hudson, who is still alive and still battling on. These people, we owe a debt of gratitude to Yami Lester and to Avon Hudson for bringing this story out into the open, where it could be taken seriously by later Australian governments, and they could start the process of uncovering. Okay, so the first British bomb was tested at Montebello Islands. It was called Operation Hurricane, 3rd of October 1952. And it was a 25 kiloton device, which is quite a big fission weapon. It was detonated in the hull of a ship anchored off one of the islands. And I'll explain why they did that in a moment. But it brought Britain into the club of atomic armed nations at number 3. The Soviet Union, of course, had already, thanks to the spies in the Manhattan Project, had tested its own weapon in 1949. Britain was number 3. It felt very annoyed with the United States for being relegated to that position. It felt it should have continued with the Manhattan Project collaboration after the war, but they were blocked out. They had to go it alone. And it was really because William Penny, the inventor of the bomb, had been such a central part of the Manhattan Project, and he had all the technical knowledge, or most technical knowledge, that they were able to do this relatively soon after the Manhattan Project bombs. And that's a destroyed bunker on Tramui Island at Montebello. They built these bunkers to test the effects of the blast. That one was partially destroyed by the blast, but they also knocked it down with a bulldozer afterwards. And there were 3 tests at Montebello. The first one was off the coast of Tramui Island in a ship, and that was to mimic what might happen in a port. The other 2 were land-based, one on Tramui and the other and on Alpha Island. I'll get to those shortly. But also at Montebello Islands, and this is a photo that I took because I sat in the caves. The deep history of these caves is extraordinary. The islands, Montebello Islands, used to be part of mainland Australia. They're part of a huge shelf that jutted out from the mainland. And there's evidence of occupation by Aboriginal Australians dating back 30,000 years, up until 7,000 years ago, when the islands were cut off from the mainland as sea levels rose. But sitting in those caves was a profound experience, knowing that they had been occupied so many thousands of years ago. And they have enormous heritage value, which was not known by the bomb makers at the time, or by the Australian government either. It's more recent times that this prehistory has come out. So that's a photo of one of the people I travelled with. So that's Marilyn Fairsky at Montebello Islands. I hope you can appreciate how beautiful this place is. A very, very beautiful archipelago. But it was used to mimic what might happen if a ship was detonated in a port. The UK authorities were really concerned about that. They really thought that was a distinct possibility. And of course, London is their capital and an important port. They have other ports as well. They were really concerned. So the first test, Operation Hurricane, was an attempt to try and understand what might happen when that happened, when a ship laden with an atomic weapon came into a port. So that was the reasoning behind a maritime test. It was a success, although the device that was detonated, which was known as Blue Danube, was unwieldy. It was not a deployable weapon. It was really big. And they very quickly wanted to move to Emu Field in South Australia to do terrestrial tests using a variation of the Blue Danube design, which was a bit similar to the design of the bomb dropped on Nagasaki in 1945. But they didn't have American resources. They didn't have enough uranium as a raw material. They didn't have enough money. And so they were trying to do it on the cheap. I call it the austerity bomb. And so by the time they got to Emu Field, it was a much more scaled down weapon, much smaller yield. But they just did a proof of concept as part of Hurricane. And then they moved to smaller weapon designs after that. This is me on the way to Emu Field. I had a broken arm. I just had a very serious operation on my arm, but nothing was going to stop me from getting there. And so it was quite a strange trip. But it's a long, bumpy ride. It's about 200 kilometers, which I think from memory is about 120 miles. But it takes more than 6 hours. It was about 6.5 hours because the road is really rough. But it was so beautiful that I barely noticed the time. It's mulga country, mulga trees with huge skies and red sands. It is so beautiful. And I was lucky enough to be in the car with the coordinator of the Oak Valley Rangers. So the Oak Valley Rangers, that's a group of Indigenous people who care for country, and they care for a huge part of this Central Australian area. No one lives at Emu Field or at Maralinga anymore. It's too dangerous. But they still go and they keep it, they clean it up and they look after the country, and it's a big part of what they do. So I was very fortunate to have the great honour to travel with the coordinator of the Oak Valley Rangers, as well as a group of people with me, including my brother, but also some scholars and we ended up writing an article about what we found. There's South Australia, which is where I was born. I was born in Adelaide, but the arrow points to Maralinga, and Emu Field is just to the north. So that's the area we're talking about. Some of you may have heard of Woomera, which is the rocket testing site. Britain used Australia for all its post-war weapons development, including testing its rockets. And Woomera is, so you can see the Woomera prohibited area, which is the area over which the rockets flew. So they used part of that area for the nuclear test site. And Len Bedell is part of the story. He was a legendary bushman, surveyor and road builder of Central Australia. And halfway between Maralinga and Emu Field, you'll find his tree, which he carved that shape out of it and painted it. He put a plaque there. The original was stolen, so it's been replaced, and it just indicates that it's midway between the two sites. Those two tests did untold damage to the people of Central Australia. And at that time, shamefully, Aboriginal people usually did not have the right to vote in the federal elections. And so they had no political representation and no one defending them, apart from a few individuals who tried their best. But there was really no one helping them. Okay, so this dramatic looking clay pan is the reason Emu Field was created where it was. This is a natural clay pan in the desert, and they were able to land military aircraft on it, and they did around the clock. They ultimately built a landing strip alongside the clay pan because the clay pan was starting to break down, but it was in furious operation all during 1953, and then they just walked away. It's known as the Murray Celeste of weapons testing sites because they left their cups of water, they left their dinner plates, they just left everything. And some people thought it was because there'd been a nuclear accident there. There wasn't. They just decided to go. Didn't like the flies, they didn't like the heat. But anyway, that's me looking at the clay pan and being amazed by it, and it is an extraordinary sight. Then after Emu, they went back to Montebello Islands, and this is one of the plinths that's left there from Operation Mosaic, which were land-based. They were on towers. And this was part of the hydrogen bomb program. It wasn't actually a hydrogen bomb that was tested there because the Australian government, for once, was quite firm that hydrogen bombs were not allowed to be tested on Australian territory. It was actually a boosted fission weapon, though, and it was extremely powerful, and it had light elements added as a boost. It also had a uranium tamper, which just meant that it was going to be a very big explosion. It's still disputed because British have not released yield data for Mosaic G2, but it was somewhere between 60 kilotons and 98 kilotons. And my money is on it being closer to 98 from the evidence that I've seen and I've written about in my forthcoming book. There was a lot of, this was in 1956 by the time this was detonated, and by then the Australian public was a little bit less happy about what the British were doing. There was a bit more political pressure. There were some movements against, and the opposition party here, the Labor Party, withdrew their support of British testing in 1956. And so it became a bit more politically contested at that point, and fallout crossed the whole continent. And continental Australia is bigger than the United States. So that's a long way. Fallout was detected in Fiji in the Pacific, way across into the Pacific. So this was a very, very big weapon. There were two bombs in that. The first one was 15 kilotons, but the second one, G2, was up to 98. Here's just an excerpt from my forthcoming book. Britain's post-war defence ambitions came to have profound and long-lasting effects on Australia. The so-called mother country ruthlessly sought ways to arm itself with these new and devastating weapons while avoiding inflicting political damage at home. Nuclear weapons designs require testing, and nuclear weapons tests, especially atmospheric tests, are always dangerous. Containing the risks of atmospheric atomic testing to a faraway country was the solution favoured by successive British governments, and the legacy of colonisation was such that Australia had no desire at the time to question why these risks had been so brazenly transferred from coloniser to colonised. So that's my job and others, is to uncover some of the reasoning and some of the aftermath and, you know, some of the things that happen as a direct result of those political decisions. So I deal with that quite a bit in my new book, Nuclear Archipelago. And that's a photo taken at Montebello Islands. That's the deckhand from the ship that we were on. We went looking at some of the mess that was left behind on one of the islands at twilight, and Will was just waiting for us to come back. So we snapped, Darren, my scholarly colleague, snapped that photo on the way back. Now, Maralinga is the next part of the saga, and that was established as a so-called permanent British atomic test site in 1956. It wasn't permanent because test ban, you know, the moratorium came in 58, 57, 58, 58 must have been. And then the partial test ban treaty came through in the early 60s. And so they abandoned Maralinga after it was in operation for a fairly short time. Maralinga, the name, it's a beautiful name, but it's not from the lands of the Anangu people who live there. It was actually taken from the Northern Territory part of Australia to the north, from an extinct language group up there. It means thunder, and that's why it was chosen. It was first described by anthropologists from the late 19th century, and it was applied to the site by a government committee because they had access to the anthropological studies from that area, and they thought thunder sounded about right, which it was. So that's the road to Maralinga, and Oak Valley is the settlement for Aboriginal people, and the Oak Valley Rangers are based there. So they're quite close. There were two series at Maralinga, and you can see there on the ground the trinitite, which you will probably be familiar with from the tests, the Trinity test in New Mexico and other areas. But the heat from nuclear weapons turns the sand to glass, and that glass is still radioactive. So you see it everywhere at Maralinga on the red sand. There were two series held there. So Operation Buffalo, there were 4 bombs. And incidentally, each one of those 4 bombs was fired in conditions that violated the agreement. So they were all fired in conditions that were unsafe. And then Operation Antler had 3 bombs the following year. Both programs had aspects that were related to the coming hydrogen weapons tests in the Pacific in 57 and 58, known as Operation Grapple. Particularly as part of Buffalo, they tested a new design called Redbeard, which was intended to be the fission trigger for a hydrogen bomb, a fusion bomb. And so that was a more compact version, a different design to Blue Danube, which was too big. So they needed a more compact design, and that was part of what was tested in those 2 series. I always get a chill when I see this photo. This is actually, I think of it as the atomic bombing of Australia. So that's the one and only airdrop of all the tests held in Australia, but that is an atomic weapon being dropped at Maralinga, just above Maralinga. It was Buffalo 3, the 3rd Buffalo bomb, October 56. And the other tests were on towers, or there was one on the ground. There was one on that was held aloft by balloons. They did different kinds of tests. But this was an airdrop because they wanted to test the V bomber, the Valiant bomber, which had just come into service. They wanted to see that they could do an airdrop, and they did, unfortunately, and it worked. So other than the major trials, as they were known, the minor trials, there were hundreds of these. Most of them were done at Maralinga. but some were held at Emu Field as well. And these were horrendously polluting, particularly Vixen B. Some of you may be familiar with the roller coaster trials in the United States, held in Nevada, which were known as safety trials, broken arrow scenarios. So what they were trying to figure out was what would happen if an aircraft carrying a nuclear weapon crashed on impact. You know, what would happen? Would there be a detonation? You know, so that's what Vixen B was about. So basically what they did, they take a cut down weapons assembly with a plutonium core and they blow it up with conventional explosives. Big plumes went up in the air and then came down to rest on the land. So about 20 kilograms of plutonium-239, which has a half-life of 12,000 years. Unbelievable. They just left it there. It was left on the surface. There were two cursory attempts by the British to do a cleanup. In fact, it's now considered that those attempts just made it worse. They just mixed it more with the dust and then it was blown around. So all the particles of plutonium got mixed with the dust. Finally, the Australian government in 1993, so it took a long time, managed to squeeze some money out of the British government to pay for a proper cleanup. The British government only paid for less than half of what it actually cost. But there was a cleanup that was carried out in the mid to late 1990s. It was not perfect. In fact, a lot of things went wrong on that cleanup. However, it did make the site safer than it was, where they had lumps of plutonium just lying on the ground previously. So they created these big pits, and you can see one of the pits there at the Taranaki site. Taranaki was the name of the Maralinga site where these really bad experiments took place, and that's where the pits are today. And no one is allowed to spend very much time there. Even with all the work they've done to clean up, it's still not very safe. This is just an excerpt from my earlier book, Atomic Thunder, the Maralinga story. And you can see a photo there of the swimming pool because it was a village, you know, people, 35,000 people, not all at once, but over a period of time lived at Maralinga. There was quite an extensive village, including having a swimming pool, having a theatre, having, you know, a bar. You know, there were lots of things they had there to make it more comfortable. But just a little quote from my book. In 2002, John Clark QC, so Queen's Counsel, a lawyer, was appointed by the Prime Minister John Howard to review veterans' entitlements, including those of nuclear veterans. Clark received 160 submissions on the British nuclear tests, and a chapter of the resulting report dealt exclusively with the veterans of the tests. Clark called the nuclear tests a unique, extraordinary event in Australia's history and found that members of the armed services were exposed to dangers beyond those normally experienced in peacetime. As one of the submissions to the inquiry put it, Australian servicemen were provided on loan to an experimental nuclear weapon test program under the control of another country without prior scientific examination, independent advice, or assessment of the potential dangers that could occur. So as you can imagine, a lot of those men, and they were all men who were stationed there, died young. And that's where the whistleblower Avon Hudson came from. He was based there at Maralinga. He saw a lot of his friends and colleagues die young. And so he became a whistleblower. He also became concerned when he heard that the land for Maralinga and Emu Field was going to be handed back to Aboriginal people. And he knew, because he'd been there, that it wasn't safe to do that. So he made a big noise about it. He made a real nuisance of himself. And people eventually started to take notice, and just as well they did. And so that was one of the factors, along with Yami Lester, along with some investigative journalism that was done in the late 70s and early 80s, that led to the establishment of the Royal Commission in 1984. So the Royal Commission was damning. It was known as a spectacle of national revenge. It was a very, very angry Royal Commission, and it went on for a very long time, and it was covered extensively in the media. So just a quote from the Royal Commission report. The 1963 Vixen Bee trials brought to an end a drama characterised by persistent deception and paranoid secrecy. In their desire to avoid international repercussions, the British authorities embarked on a course of determined concealment of information from the Australian government. So the Australian government did not know what they did and what they left behind. So the process of uncovering the long-term effects of the British tests was started by whistleblowers in the 1970s, continued through journalistic investigation and the Royal Commission, and it continues to this day. Now, many British files are still closed, and historians and survivors find it difficult to get to the heart of everything that was done in Australia. We try, but the British government is a bit of an immovable object. There's a potential court case. I'm not going to say it's a court case yet, but there's a potential court case building in the United Kingdom. And it's specifically centred on the fact that a lot of the British service personnel who had medical tests done and they had film badges, they had different ways of measuring their exposure to radioactivity, they were never given access to their medical records. And so that is illegal, basically. And so the court case is centred around that. And it's a very expensive court case. So the survivors are trying to raise the money to proceed with it. But it could be both a civil case for compensation, but there's also been a brief of evidence presented to the Metropolitan Police in London, I believe, for a criminal action as well. The problem is British law sometimes restricts, if it's too many years since an event, it's sometimes difficult. So that's a difficulty they're facing over there. But hopefully that case will get up, because that will mean a lot more evidence will come out into the light. It's an ongoing project to uncover the truth. I don't need to tell you that, you know all about it, but I am continuing my research into British nuclear tests. There's a lot more still to find out, even though my 3 books cover the 3 test sites, but there are more things, and I'm looking at potential projects to keep going with once Nuclear Archipelago is released. So stay tuned. There'll be more on that. And these are my books. Bottom one, Atomic Thunder, was the first one, and that's a picture from Maralinga next to it. And then Emu Field, so that relates to the picture above with my colleagues, Darren and Leander. And then Nuclear Archipelago, the new one, it's not out yet, it'll be out in August. And that's a photo with another colleague, Paul Grace, who's also written on Montebello, and one of the descendants. So in the background, you can just see Maxine. She's the daughter of a serviceman who was harmed by the Montebello tests, and her father died young. And so she came on the trip to Montebello because she wanted to find out what had happened to her dad. And she's a particularly lovely person. So, and it's just tragic what happened to her. But you can multiply that thousands of times to service personnel and Indigenous people. So thank you. Thank you so much for your attention. I feel I've probably talked enough, but I'm very, very happy to answer any of your questions. So I'll just stop sharing. We'll just see if we've got any questions.
Thank you very much for joining us. Mercifully, the timeline worked in your favor today, so we're not keeping you up. Some of our guests from England have had a rougher time than you. I'm sure this is an issue that many, if not all of the people on this session here tonight were totally unfamiliar with. So we're very, very grateful for you to bring that to our attention. So now we move into the next phase of this evening, where you in attendance will have an opportunity to dialogue with our guest. And I'm going to turn that over to Jan Boudart to explain what goes on, and she will be facilitating this part of the session. So thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for the talk, Liz. It was really interesting and good. So I wanted to just introduce the housekeeping as far as questioning goes. And many of the people who have been here before know these so-called rules. Each person gets one follow-up question after their question is answered. And if you're making a comment or a long question, or don't need feedback from the speaker, your comment may not be more than 3 minutes. Please do not ask a series of questions, one at a turn. You will get a second chance to speak if it is before 1/2 past the hour and nobody else has their hand raised. And this is how you get on the stack. You raise your hand from the icon at the bottom where it says react. If you click that, there will be a bar that says raise hand. And then you'll see, maybe on your screen, you can see Bob Cruteau has raised his hand. And or in the chat, you can say stack or I have a question, and we'll try to find it in the stack. It's a little bit hard to be doing two things, but I think we're pretty good at keeping track of the stack that comes from the chat. And you can raise your hand in your screen box like this, and we'll try to get you in line in order. So it looks like Bob has our first question, and I actually have the second one. So go ahead, Bob.
Thank you so much for this disturbing presentation, and it's very typical, I would think, of those in power to just totally disregard, people in this way. I was wondering what you meant by radiological experiments or whatever it was testing.
Yes, thank you for that, Bob. So the radiological experiments, as opposed to the nuclear experiments, were the ones where there was, at least theoretically, no chain reaction. So they used radioactive material, and in particular in the Vixen B experiments, they used plutonium-239. They used uranium in some of the others, but it was mostly plutonium that they were using, sometimes plutonium-240. And these were tests where in Vixen B, they would detonate a warhead using conventional explosives. But in Vixen A, they would set it on fire, for example. So now the Royal Commission did discover that in one of the Vixen B experiments, there was a chain reaction, and that was completely contrary to any agreement they had with the Australian government. They kept that very quiet. But generally speaking, those tests were radiological rather than nuclear. So they were not intended to produce a nuclear chain reaction. It's just that the nature of Vixen B meant that they came very close. And in fact, they crossed that line once that we know of.
So was this a concept of what we call a dirty bomb? Were they experimenting
Yes.
with dirty bombs?
It was exactly that, a dirty bomb. These were dirty bombs, particularly Vixen B. There were other kinds of experiments too that fell under the heading of minor trials. So, for instance, they would shoot pellets of plutonium into a container of salt. It's sort of crazy stuff that they were doing, but they were just constantly trying that. All of these experiments were just intended to test components, to test what would happen in certain scenarios, when there might be a fire, there might be a crash. So that's what it was all about. But yes, they were dirty bombs, basically. Yeah.
Thank you.
My question is about South Australia, because recently South Australia itself has been in the news because they are 100% solar, and they are not all of their electricity now is coming from solar energy. And I'm just wondering if you're aware, what you have to say about that.
I am. Well, it's not continuous 100% all the time. So they have reached points where it has been, at this moment, we're 100%. There was a big battery bank put in by the dreaded Elon Musk. I hate to mention his name, but he did, after there was a big outage some years, maybe 6 or 7 years ago, that took the whole state out. And in the wake of that, there was talk about what to do because that was a catastrophe for the state. And so one of the solutions was to install batteries. and Elon Musk came along and installed a big battery. I don't know the proportion of the state's energy that comes from that battery now. I don't know. But South Australia is a very, very sunny state. A lot of it is desert, and it's a relatively small population as well. And so in the 1950s, the then Premier of South Australia tried desperately to get a nuclear power plant going in South Australia, but the federal government knocked it back. But yes, these days they do have a lot of solar there, and they pride themselves on being much more on renewable energy than on fossil fuel energy. But it's, as I understand it, it's not 100% all the time on solar, but they can manage most of their energy requirements. I think they're still connected to the national grid, though, for some things. Yeah.
Okay, I wanted to mention that Bob is a board member of NEIS, and of course, Dave is our director, and he's got the next question.
Yes, thanks. Actually, I have two types of questions, but I'll only ask one in case other people have questions they want. Let me just start with radiation standards. You may have heard in our country, President Trump is contemplating raising the standards to the general public and to the workforce. We have previously used, things like as low as reasonably ALARA, as low as reasonably achievable, and we've adopted the linear threshold model for radiation, but that seems to be on the chopping block coming up. So I'm curious about what radiation standard levels are used in Australia, and are they also under threat given this new nuclear renaissance that seems to be sweeping the world?
Okay, so we are not a nuclear nation. We do not have any kind of nuclear power here. The only reactor we have is at a place called Lucas Heights, which is an experimental reactor on the outskirts of Sydney, and it mostly is used for creating medical isotopes. So, and even that was hugely, hugely controversial. All attempts to have nuclear reactors here have failed. There was quite a concerted attempt. I mentioned South Australia in the 50s, but also in the 1960s, there was quite a well-advanced plan to have a reactor built at a place called Jervis Bay on the coast of New South Wales. That failed for financial reasons at the time. So the only nuclear standards would be connected with scientific research and the production of medical isotopes. So, but at the time of the British nuclear tests, there was, and I always forget the name, but the International Energy Commission, it's 4 words, not 3, but which had started in 1926 or something, in the wake of Marie Curie's work and, all the work around radiation then. And they set standards, but the British quite consciously went their own way. They developed their own standards. And these standards were deliberately rather elastic because they wanted to put people in harm's way. I mentioned Operation Mosaic in 1956. Part of that operation was deliberately placing a ship, HMS Diana, with all its crew in the path of fallout. And to be able to do that, they had to set their own standards. So they set 3 different standards, basically, the normal virtually no exposure, but then they moved up into other forms of exposure that would enable them to put people in harm's way. So they actually established those standards in time for Operation Hurricane in 1952, because at the conclusion of that test, they wanted to send people into the hot zone to retrieve equipment, to make measurements, to do all the things they wanted. And they couldn't do it with the more restrictive international standards that were current at that time, and which I believe the United States was adhering to. But the British didn't want to adhere to those same standards. And so they found ways around them and developed their own standards. And they kind of tightened them up a little bit for Maralinga, I think, but basically they didn't want anyone to be able to stop them from sending people into radioactive areas. And nothing did stop them. They sent a lot of people into, during Operation Buffalo in 1956, they had what is known as the Indoctrinee Force, which was a group of mostly British officers, but there were a fair few Australians as well and a few New Zealanders who were deliberately placed very close to ground zero. And it was specifically to test what would happen in the event of a war. So they not only were they physically present as individuals, but they also had to lay out, guns and tanks and weapons and things like that to see what would happen. Then they had to go and check what had happened after each blast. So you're getting the idea they didn't have very high safety standards here, not even the accepted international standards of the day, which were probably quite crude compared to the standards of now.
As a quick follow-up, you mentioned there's not a nuclear power program now, and who knows if there will be in the future. Everyone always tries again. But doesn't Australia mine uranium? And do they not
yes.
export it? I would imagine there'd be
Yeah.
some kind of radiation standards for that as well. But
Oh, yes, no, you're quite right. The extractive industries, yes, certainly. So they have standards. And they're probably these days, whatever the international standards are. And I mean, uranium mining has been a source of huge controversy in Australia. And it's, at its peak, there were a number of mines in operation, but there are far fewer now. Off the top of my head, I couldn't tell you, there are 2 or 3 at the most, I think, in operation now. But yes, you're quite right. And a lot of the controversy, of course, is that, we had this non-nuclear nation, and yet we were sending the raw materials off to places like India and, where we didn't know how it was going to be used. So it's always been a very controversial thing, and it's caused a lot of political strife for whoever is in government at the time. There's not a lot about it right at the moment, and I have to confess I don't know a lot about the current situation. I know more about what was happening at the time of the British nuclear tests and how Britain sent high-level political delegations to Australia to try and convince Australia to hand over uranium deposits. But the Americans came in and did some deals as well. And so America got quite a bit of our uranium. But for the later British tests, some of the raw material, obviously in a reactor turned into plutonium, that came from Australia. So, there was a kind of a sadness there. I think that, it was our raw materials, but it came back to us as bombs. Terrible.
thank you.
Yes, thank you. Our next questioner is Connie Klein. She's a longtime activist from Ohio. And speaking of corruption, you'd have a hard time outdoing what's been going on in Ohio. So, Connie, you go ahead and ask your question.
Hello, thank you so much for this presentation. It was very interesting. My question is, has there been, or do you anticipate that there will be any compensation for either the Aboriginal people or the military? The idea, it's the same idea here in the States, let them get old enough so that they die, so we don't have to compensate them. Although there is some compensation here. So I was wondering what that situation is in Australia.
Thanks, Connie. Yes, important question. So Australia has done slightly better here than the UK has done. So at the time of the Royal Commission, there was a legal team representing Aboriginal people, and I know one of the lawyers very well. He's a friend of mine. And at the time, he and his co-counsel made it their business to get the name of every single Aboriginal person who was affected by the nuclear test, whether they gave evidence or not. And they took those names to the federal government, and the federal government granted compensation without it having to go to court for Aboriginal people. So there was, it was not a large payment, but it was enough to feed into Oak Valley and make Oak Valley a more comfortable place for them to live. They'd all been taken off their land at the time of the tests. Oak Valley was an opportunity for them to go back to their land. And so that money helped a little with that. It wasn't much. With the military veterans, they were granted, many of them, I can't remember how many, it was about 160 of them were granted what is known as administrative compensation, which was a relatively token amount, you know, say $100,000 or something like that, for without them having to prove anything in court. So that was just an administrative procedure. They were reviewed administratively and then granted some compensation. The only person who succeeded in court was a fellow called Rick Johnston, who was a veteran, and he took the Australian government to court, and he won compensation in the order of something like $600,000. Died relatively soon after that, unfortunately, but he's the only one who succeeded in court. In the UK, they have been fighting for years for any kind of compensation, and they've not had any. So the one concession that was made fairly recently, might be 2 years ago, the British government decided to give them all a medal, right? You know, and it's not even a proper campaign medal, it's a ceremonial medal. But this court case, which I hope will get off the ground, it's not off the ground yet, but hopefully that will bring recognition and compensation. But Britain has been very, very poor and has not really recognised the suffering of its own personnel. But as I say, in Australia, there have been bits and pieces of compensation, not enough, of course, never enough, but somewhat better than what Britain did.
Mm-hmm. You can't really compensate a person for taking their life away.
No, it's impossible. You can't. But they could have done a little bit better. You know, they could have, you know, yeah. So, I mean, there were certainly many more British service personnel than Australian. So there are about 25,000 British service personnel who are involved in the tests. And I think from memory, about 10,000 Australian personnel. So, you know, it's still a substantial number. There were some New Zealanders, some Canadians as well. At times, there were even some Americans here as observers. So for Operation Totem at Emu Field, there was at least one crew of a super fortress. It might have been two American crews out here. And the interesting thing about that is that the British crew of their V-bombers, or their Canberra aircraft actually, noticed that the American personnel had far higher safety standards than they did.
Yeah, I remember that
from the book. Yeah, that's right. And they started to ask questions about that, because the British and the Australian air crew and the ground crew were not, they had no safety measures at all. And they noticed that the Americans were much more careful about safety. And of course, the Americans were much more experienced in nuclear testing.
Right.
Yeah, so they did start. And so the Australian Air Force started to get quite worried. And I've seen some of the correspondence on this in the reports and so on, that particularly for Hurricane, the Australian crews who flew into the nuclear clouds were not protected at all. So questions were asked at a pretty high level about that. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Our next questioner is Alfred Meyer, who is an expert on the relationship between nuclear power and nuclear weapons, and it's what he does is talk to people about that and write about it. So go ahead, Alfred, and ask your question.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for a really phenomenal presentation, and so important to know about this. I wanted to bring up the Australia, United Kingdom, United States nuclear arrangement, otherwise known as AUKUS. And I wanted to ask, do you know how far along that is in Australia, how big it is financially, and is this kickstarting, a whole Australian nuclear enterprise? And the affiliated question is, what is the public awareness and attitude towards it?
Yeah, it's a great question, Alfred. Thank you. AUKUS is, in my estimation, and I'm not involved in researching it, but it appears to be extremely unpopular. It was instigated by a previous government, a Conservative government led by Scott Morrison, who was a very hated Prime Minister. But unfortunately, the government that succeeded him, a Labor government, has sort of run with it. And it was all kind of signed up before Donald Trump came back.
Mm-hmm.
And the return of Trump has caused a lot of disquiet here because it appears that Australia has got the rough end of the deal now that Trump's back, because America first, blah, 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 and so it's looking like Australia is going to pay billions and billions of dollars for submarines that we might not even get, because there is a clause in the agreement that gives America an out. And they can just suddenly decide for national security reasons that the submarines that it's been building, they're going to keep for themselves instead of sending them to Australia. So a lot of us, I mean, I'm not directly involved, although I do know people who are saying we should cut our losses. We've already spent billions of dollars on this stupid agreement, but we should cut our losses now and get out, because, depending on what happens with Trump, whether he decides not to have elections anymore and continues on, that it's very unlikely that he's actually going to honor the agreement. And we would have spent a huge part of our, national finances on something that is not going to happen. But it's not just that. People are very concerned because we have never been a nuclear nation other than the extractive industries and that one little reactor. And people don't want it. We don't want nuclear submarines in our ports. And the waste that is generated from that as well, that will have to be disposed of in our country. And people, some people say, oh, just take it to Maralinga because it's already contaminated. Well, I'm sorry, but the Oak Valley Rangers might have something to say about that. And there are Aboriginal agreements around that land, and you can't just do that. So it's not popular. The current government, the Labor government under our Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, is under a lot of pressure about this. The Trump administration decided to review the whole thing anyway. Soon after Trump was inaugurated, some sort of review was instigated, and everyone thought, well, that's the end of the agreement. But it hasn't ended because I suspect the Trump administration is seeing dollar signs from Australia. We've become a bit of a chump in this. We're going to give our money over to an administration who doesn't care at all about us. So there are some of us who are quite concerned about that. So I think the AUKUS agreement was always a bit of a dud anyway, because as an historian of the British nuclear tests, I know that Britain doesn't care about us either. So we've got both of these bigger countries sort of taking advantage of Australia. And I think it's a real pity that successive Australian governments haven't recognised that for what it is. And if they knew a bit of the history, they might understand it a bit better. But I think it's a terrible idea. I've always thought that, but particularly now with Trump sitting in the White House.
A very quick follow-up on a slightly unrelated question. Are you familiar with an organization in Melbourne called thejuicemedia.com? They have a stunning 4-minute video about Australia's nuclear program. I'd suggest checking them out, thejuicemedia.com. They're some of the most phenomenal communicators I've come across.
Thanks for that, Alfred. I'm not familiar with it, so I'll seek them out. Thank you.
Alfred, you might put that in the chat as well, so that'll be sent around to everyone later.
Sure thing.
Well, thank you for the questions and the answers. So our next questioner is Jake. Jake, you need to unmute and ask your question. Are you trying to unmute, Jake? Jake, do you mind? We'll go on and oh, you figured it out.
Okay,
go
can
ahead.
I hear you? Can
Yeah.
I hear you? Okay. Thank you for your talk. My question is, where does England do its nuclear weapons testing?
Okay, so it doesn't test anymore. The only testing it did was in Australia, so the tests that I outlined, but it also tested at in the Pacific as well for its hydrogen bomb tests. So, and that was what is now known as Kiribati, but back then was known as Christmas Island in the Pacific. And it did, I think, 12 hydrogen bomb tests there. But by the end of the 1950s, with the repeal of the McMahon Act or parts of the McMahon Act in the United States, Britain went back in with the United States for testing. And so, and it dropped all its own designs. So Blue Danube, Redbeard, all the different designs that it had been testing in Australia, it no longer, they weren't produced anymore. So British nuclear weapons these days are American weapons that they purchased. So, but as far as I'm aware, America has not actually carried out any tests since the early 1990s. I think that's correct. In fact, this group will know better than me about American testing. But certainly up until that time, Britain was testing with America. It was involved with American tests then.
Okay, and I have one. Thank you. I have one follow-up question, which is, what was my? Could you repeat again the name of the act that was on the books that prohibited the United States from sharing information with other countries?
Yes, certainly. It was called the McMahon Act, MCMAHON, McMahon Act. Its official name was the Atomic Energy Act of 1946. So, and the British hated that law, but yeah, so that was the McMahon Act, and it kept Britain away from America's nuclear test program for a good 10 years, probably more than that.
Okay. Thank you.
Tracy, can you unmute and ask your question now?
Hello.
Good. Good. Hi.
Thank you for a very informative and entertaining presentation, Elizabeth. If I heard you correctly, you said that Clement Attlee was an early important developer of the British bomb and a communist. Are those
What name? Sorry, what name can you repeat?
Clement Attlee?
Oh, Clement Attlee. He was the Prime Minister of Great Britain.
And a communist.
He was the head of the Labour Party. I don't think he was a communist. He was, but you know, the Labour Party in Great Britain is a left-leaning party, but he wasn't a communist.
Okay, I 63-year-old ears, 67-year-old ears. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Okay.
No problem.
Thank you, Trace. Okay, our next questioner is Ace Hoffman, who is also an author, and he wrote the, I guess I better not, the Code Breakers.
Code Killers.
The Code Killers, okay. And anyway, it's interesting, and it's a very highly illustrated book, and he's showing some of his work behind him. Go ahead, Ace.
Okay, so this is the NTS and all of all the American bombs. It's an animation I did showing all of them. And about 11 years ago, my wife and I interviewed a bunch of American bomb, military veterans. And so I can assure you that they went through some pretty bad stuff too. For example, one of the guys we actually interviewed, his job was to parachute directly into ground zero. very shortly after the bomb. As soon as the dust had blown away. So there's that. And also, I believe you tested, or Britain tested a few bombs at the Nevada test site, maybe half a dozen or so. And lastly, how much opposition is there to that submarine? Because don't forget, Trump can probably turn it off remotely if he feels like it. So I strongly advise you not buy it.
I don't want them to buy it. I really don't want them to. Trump is capable of anything. And so there's a lot of concern. I think there's growing. I mean, it was bad enough prior to Trump coming back. People were getting worried even then. But I think the concern has really ramped up since then. So, and a lot of people are saying, we will never see a submarine here anyway. They're not going to actually honor the agreement. So we will have just lost billions and billions of dollars and we'll get nothing for it. And also a lot of people are saying that the kinds of submarines that they want to build are not suitable for our area anyway, for the the Asia Pacific area, that we would have been better off. Australia broke a contract with France. We were getting conventional submarines from France. Enormously annoyed Emmanuel Macron. And those submarines were actually more suitable for the environment. I mean, I'm not a military historian. I don't know enough about the military side of it, but as I understand it, the ones that they've negotiated to come out of the AUKUS agreement are simply not suitable anyway. They're too big, or they're otherwise unsuitable. So the whole thing is just crazy. And even if we lose a lot of money, I think we'll still be better off in the long run if we break the agreement. But there's no appetite in the current Australian government to break that agreement. They're forging ahead. So we have a fairly hawkish Deputy Prime Minister who spends a lot of time in Washington, unfortunately. And he, Richard Marles is his name, and he is very much in favour, perhaps more so than the Prime Minister. And under this current government, I can't see them stepping away from it, unfortunately.
Thank you. It was a wonderful talk, a terrible subject, but a wonderful talk.
Yeah.
Thanks, Kate.
Okay, it looks like Jake has another question, but it is 28 minutes after the hour, and we're actually scheduled to be done by half after. I won't try to mention the hour because it's completely different for Elizabeth. So, Jake, you're probably getting the last question, Jake. Go ahead.
Jake, you need to unmute.
We haven't heard you yet, Jake. Oh, there we go.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, now
okay.
we can hear you.
My question is, does the Australian government see the Chinese as a threat?
Oh, okay. Well, China is one of our major trading partners, and so we have an interesting relationship with them in that, we're wary of them. And the previous government, the Conservative government under Scott Morrison, really annoyed them enormously. And so they cut trade ties for some of our products. But the current government has reinstated some of that. And so we have a productive relationship with China for the most part, but there's a wariness there, certainly. And, in the 50s, there was the yellow peril scares, all of that ran through. We've got past all of that. And we do, a lot of Chinese people live in Australia. We're very close. We're part of the Asia Pacific environment. So I don't think there's an imminent threat from China, but they're certainly they're considered with some wariness, but we need them because they buy all our primary production. So yeah, we need them.
Okay, now we are at the half hour, and
This will be very quick, but I want to make one thing.
Yeah, okay, Ace, go ahead.
Oh dear, now I've forgotten what it was. I'm sorry. It was really important, but I can't remember.
It's up to Elizabeth whether she wants to continue beyond the half hour anyway. So actually,
I'm okay.
Well, Ace, if it comes back to you, make sure you put it in the chat. because we do share the chat, and maybe you'll get an answer after the event through the chat.
So,
And I saw a question in the chat too, which I can quickly answer if you
oh,
like,
yes, go
about
ahead.
access to contaminated lands. So, so Maralinga is controlled by Aboriginal people these days. It was handed back to them 20 odd years ago. They actually run a tourism operation there, but to go there, you have to get a permit and you can't enter, and you're told about the risks, and there are signs everywhere. And you might have seen some of the signs in my presentation anyway, some of which are in Aboriginal language. To go to Emu Field, that is still restricted by our Department of Defence. So you not only need an Aboriginal permit, you also need a Defence Department permit to go to Emu Field. It's not open to the public. To go to Montebello, anyone can go, but it's very hard to get to, and it's very expensive to get to. It's a long way out into the ocean. It takes about 8 hours on a boat. But once you're there are signs up. But my concern is that, they say you can't spend more than 1 hour at ground zero at Montebello. People don't take that seriously enough. But we had a Geiger counter on our trip, and it's a very real risk, very real. So, yes, that is a bit of a concern. There are more controls around the South Australian sites than there are around the Western Australian sites. So that's something I mentioned in my new book, and it'll be interesting to see if anyone acts upon that.
I remembered what it was, and it's kind of important. But it's long ago. George Bush was in one of the first nuclear renaissance, and he said that people were asking about the waste problem. He said, we're going to send it back to where it came from. Now, of course, it's millions of times more hazardous when it's finished. And he was specifically referring to to nuclear fuel we were getting from Australia, and that we would send it back used and very poisonous. So I just wanted to warn you about that.
Oh, I know all about
I know it's
that.
a long time ago.
We've even had a Royal Commission about that, because they wanted to set up a nuclear waste disposal site in South Australia, but not at Maralinga. I can't remember the name of the site now. It was stopped by activism. And so we are not accepting waste from whoever has processed our uranium at the moment. But there is a tension quite often, because there is a sense where we sent that stuff out there. We have a responsibility for it, but there is nowhere in Australia that wants it. And the court cases, the litigation that goes on around it, the activism is huge. And so I can't see it happening right away. I mean, we do deal with waste from Lucas Heights, the medical isotope facility, that sort of low-level waste, but not from, power plants or weapons or anything like that. So we're not currently doing that, but it'll come back up again, no doubt, as an issue. It comes and goes, that one.
Okay, I wanted to just point out the work that Lily Singer has done, and she put it in the chat. I believe she interviewed you before this session, and she developed this publicity that you can see by looking at the chat. So I just wanted to, Lily, can you, let's see, the full record is, video NEIS, video at NEIS, and that's the YouTube channel. And this is where you'll see this and this recording, and probably the interview she did with Elizabeth before the night with the experts. And it is now 3 minutes past the half hour, and I'm turning this back over to Dave.
All right. Well, thank you, Jan, and certainly thank you, Elizabeth. I'm going to share screen for a minute here, and then let you folks know what is coming up at Night with the Experts for the future. As we said when we started the year off, we were hopefully going to keep to themes, and certainly tonight's presentation from Australia is an example of that theme of the effects on local communities, on people, on the Aborigines in Australia. Last month we heard about the Pacific Northwest. I'm pleased to say that next month we will have Dr. Mariah Gomez from University of New Mexico, who will be talking about nuclear colonialism, which is will be a real treat. We saw her presentation last fall at DePaul University, and we invite you to come back for a very, very interesting presentation. But again, the theme is there that the people are the ones who are always the ones who are affected the most by this. And then in April, we have a return guest, David Lochbaum, formerly with the Union of Concerned Scientists, who is now a member of the GRIP board, that stands for the Generational Radiation Impact Project. He's going to be talking about the changes that are proposed in radiation standards in the Executive Order 14300 that President Trump put out last May. So it'll be a continuation of radiation issues for these months. When I hear the stories that you tell, Elizabeth, and others who have told, especially relating to England and Australia and the United States, it reminds me of the story of when Gandhi was leaving England after his first visit, and a reporter asked him, well, what do you think of Western civilization now, Mr. Gandhi? And his reply was, I think it would be a good idea. And clearly these stories illustrate that more than anything else, I believe. I'll give one last plug, and I'm surprised Jan didn't mention this already. NEIS is going to be hosting the 2026 Chicago version of the International Uranium Film Fest. And that will be at DePaul University in Chicago, April 24th through the 26th. And I would point out that April 26th this year is the 40th anniversary of the Chernobyl disaster. So it'll be an event that is open to the public for free. We'll have more information up on the NEIS website soon, and we'll be sending out information to those of you who attend Night with the Experts. I would also point out next month, when we have Dr. Gomez here, we will not be meeting on the last Thursday. Next month in March, Night with the Experts will meet on the 19th, which is the third Thursday. And that had to do with some scheduling issues that came up at that time. So circular calendars on the 19th. We will be back in business then. So again, thank you very much for a terrific presentation tonight. It will be up on our YouTube page, as Jan mentioned, and you will all be receiving a copy of the chat sometime tonight or tomorrow morning. If you have any questions, you can put them in the chat now before we sign out, and maybe you'll get an answer after that. So with that, I will conclude my remarks tonight. And again, thank you very, very much, Professor Tynan, for joining us tonight, and good luck with the new book.
Thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure. Lovely to meet you all.
And you too.
Bye-bye.
All right, folks. Good night.
Good night.